Welcome back to Three Go Searching by Patricia St. John. When we left off last time, Waffy and David had been captured by the men and were setting off in the little boat at night. Silver Track on the Sea, Chapter 7. The boys did not know how long they sat in that boat. It might have been minutes or hours, for they had lost all sense of time. They only knew that the night was growing darker and darker, and they were growing colder and colder. David's foot went to sleep, but he dared not rub it, nor did he dare to think of the kitchen light shining out onto the cliff behind him, nor of Dad, who was probably out looking for him by this time, nor of Mother with her warm arms, who would now be thinking that he was late and naughty. The tears brimmed over silently and ran down his cheeks, but he dared not lift his hand to wipe them away. He thought it must be nearly morning, but actually they had only been out there about half an hour when they heard the sound of quick footsteps on the pebbles and a little splash of water as the men waded out to the ledge in the rock. There was the sound of a sharp, frightened question, an answer, the words of which they could not hear, and then the sound of scuffling, and although they still dared not look up or move, they knew that three faces were watching them. "Well," said the first voice, very quietly, "what are you going to do with them?" "Take them out to where the water is deep," said the second voice. "If they have seen what there is to see, they must not go home again. You can't trust children. The Coast Guard would be waiting for us at the other side, and it would be prison for all of us." "Be careful," said the deep voice of the man who had caught them. "One of them is a European child." "All the worse," said the second. "He's probably French, and they will be down to look for him in no time. We'd better get moving. Guard those children with your gun. They might try to escape where it is shallow." The little craft lurched against the creek bank as its owner let himself down into it, followed immediately by the second man. A moment later, David felt his arms secured firmly with a rope, and he was lifted up, helpless, and then tied to the back seat. The other man stepped swiftly across and did the same to Waffy, and two rags were tied firmly around their mouths. It was all a matter of seconds, so quickly and purposefully did the men move. And when David came to his senses again, the boat was out of the creek, and the men were rowing swiftly and silently, their oars making practically no sound as they struck the water. They rowed for about 10 minutes and then leaned toward the control panel in the prow. A quiet chug-chug started up, and the boat began to move fast, kicking up a little at the throbbing of the engines. The first man got up and stepped over to the boys in the back of the boat and cut the rags from their mouths. Waffy burst into hysterical screams, but it did not matter now. They were too far from the shore for anyone to hear, and they were getting out into the deep waters. David did not scream, because it did not seem to help, but he turned his head to look at the top of the cliff far behind them. He thought it must be nearly the middle of the night, but the lights were still shining. Of course they were, thought David, for Mother and Dad would never go to bed without him. Only Joan would be lying asleep in her cot, rosy and curly, her doll clasped in her arm. He had never known before how much he loved Joan. He dared not think too hard about his parents, lest his heart should break. His neck was too strained to look backward any longer, so he tucked his head and blinked in surprise, for the water ahead was no longer gray, but silver. The moon had risen, making a silver track of light across the sea, just as it had done on the night when he'd become a true son of God. He suddenly remembered the story he had read that morning. "It is I, be not afraid," said Jesus to poor frightened Peter. And Peter had probably stepped down from the boat and walked along the shining pathway, leading straight from him to the feet of Jesus. Perhaps that silver track was now God's way of reminding him that Jesus was still close beside him on that lonely sea, reaching out his hand to him, loving him, keeping him. "Wafi," he whispered, "I'm going to pray." Wafi, finding that no one took the slightest notice, had stopped screaming and was huddled, exhausted, on the seat with his head resting on David's shoulder, his body shaken with quiet sobbing. Yet he had wondered, in the midst of his terror, at David's controlled stillness. Did David really believe that his God could save them? Was there some power known only to Christians that could help them now? Wafi felt he would willingly try anything if only he knew how. He wriggled as close as he could to David. The pressure of their cold little bodies comforted them. "Who are you?" asked the taller man, turning to them suddenly. "You, son of our country, what is your father?" A truck driver," whispered Wafi through chattering teeth. The shore lights were all left behind now, and the water looked very, very deep. "And you, the French boy," rapped out the man, "who is your father and where do you live?" He spoke in French, and David stared at him blankly. "I don't understand. I am English," he replied in the man's native language. The man peered at him curiously. "English? And he speaks with our tongue," he exclaimed. "Who are you?" "I'm the son of the doctor at the English hospital," answered David, and at the thought of his kind, strong father, his voice trembled. But the man had come very close to him and was staring hard at the little white face lifted to his in the moonlight. "The English doctor's son?" repeated the man, the tall doctor with the little scar on his forehead. "Yes," answered David, and this time he gave a little sob. The man sat down quite close to him, still staring and stroking his beard. Suddenly he turned to his friend who was steering the ship. "That doctor is a faithful man," he said, "and a father to the poor. When I was a boy, my parents died, and no one dressed the sores on my leg. He found me and took me in. I was months in that hospital, and he dressed my wounds with his own hands. Without him, I should have been a lame beggar. I will not harm one hair of his son's head. We must think of some other plan." "There's no other plan," cried his friend in alarm. "If those children reach home, we are lost." No, we are not," replied the first, who seemed to be working something out. "Listen to me. In the dark hour before the dawn, we shall pass the next headland. We will sail in at the foot of the cliff and leave the children on the beach at the bottom of the path. Within the hour, we will hand over the guns and receive the money, and that's enough for me. The children will walk for some hours before they find a village, and then they will sleep. The hillmen and their donkeys do not move fast. It may be sunset tonight or even tomorrow before they will return them to their parents. At dawn, we can hide the boat, and the guns will be up high in the mountains long before nightfall. The tribesmen have their own paths to the frontier, and they do not give away secrets." The other man seemed troubled and angry. A long, whispered argument followed, and the little boat throbbed on through the deep, deep water. Suddenly, the first speaker turned back and looked at the boys. I am not afraid of that one, he said, pointing at Wafi. He is a son of our country, and our war is his war. His people will not betray us. It is the other one I fear. And yet, for his father's sake, I will not harm him. He leaned over till his face was very close to David's. Listen, little one, he said, we will take you safe to land. And when you reach home, tell your father all that happened. Tell him he was merciful to me when I was a child, and I have been merciful to his child. And tell him, for the love for the love he bears toward the people and the land, not to betray us. I'll remember, said David solemnly, and I'll explain to my father that we mustn't tell. He was shivering with cold and dizzy with sleep and strain, but he was no longer afraid. This man was kind, and somehow, someday, they would reach home again. The man got up suddenly, took a knife from his pocket, and cut the cords that bound the children. He laid them down gently between the seats and covered them with an old piece of sailcloth. The boards were hard, and the night air was cold, but the sea rocked them gently, and the splash of the silver water on the prow soothed them like a lullaby. The moon had swung clear of the horizon, and David looked up into its pure, bright face. The light seemed to wrap him in a shining peace, as though strong, loving arms were holding him fast. He flung his own arm across poor, frightened little Wafi, as though to draw him closer to his own comfort. I wish Wafi knew, he thought to himself. Oh, I wish he knew. And then everything faded, and he slept as deeply and soundly as if he were in his bed at home, and the stars in their settings shone above him, and the moon moved in its course toward the black summits of the mountains. The dark hour before the dawn was drawing near, and the little craft, with its precious burden, turned inland toward the lovely beaches of the hill country.